Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Those who have seen my videos before will notice that this video is a bit different because I have a new piece of kit, so here I am. Today I'm going to be analysing a poem by the brilliant Charlotte Smith, her second sonnet from her Elegiac Sonnets, which were first published in 1784, the title of which is Written at the Close of Spring. It's a seemingly simple sonnet, but actually it's far more complicated than it first appears, which I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start by reading the poem. I'm then going to provide a quick summary of the overall meaning of the poem, and then I want to analyse some of the details. I'm going to start by looking at the sonnet form. So I'm going to talk about rhyme scheme and the form of the overall poem, so the structure of the overall poem. And I'm going to outline a Shakespearean sonnet and what a Shakespearean sonnet is, and then what a Petrarchan sonnet is. And I'm going to think about how Smith amalgamates those two different types of sonnet and what that means for our understanding of the poem. I'm then going to close read some of the particular details. I'm going to start off by looking at the way that Smith plays with enjambment. I'm then going to move on to look at Smith's use of diction and how she provides comparisons between different images through her use of diction. And then I'm going to look at her use of repetition, particularly the way that she repeats the word again. And you'll see why the fact that she repeats the word again and the way that she repeats the word again adds to the meaning of the poem, because this is a poem about spring coming again, about renewal. And it's significant, therefore, that she sometimes repeats the word again and sometimes doesn't. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel, then do please subscribe, and if you like the video, do give it a big thumbs up. If you want to leave any comments, then I really do love hearing from you. I've been enjoying our conversations that we've been having recently. To start then, I'm going to read the poem. The garlands fade that spring so lately wove, each simple flower which she has nursed in dew, anemones that spangled every grove, the primrose wan, and harebell mildly blue. No more shall violets linger in the dell, or purple orchis variegate the plain, till spring again shall call forth every bell, and dress with human hands her wreaths again. Ah, poor humanity, so frail, so fair are the fond visions of thy early day, till tyrant passion and corrosive care bid all thy fairy colours fade away. Another May new buds and flowers shall bring. Ah, why has happiness no second spring? In summary then, Written at the Close of Spring compares nature, particularly spring, and humanity. In many ways we can see why this is a proto-romantic poem, why it influences romanticism so much, because it's about humanity's engagement with nature, how nature makes humans feel. So we have on the one hand the hope and the beauty of spring, and on the other we have the corruption and the sadness of humanity. Spring is youthful, it's hopeful, it's about renewal, and in that word renewal we have the idea of newness. So within the poem, Smith talks about new buds coming again in spring, the idea of newness, freshness, life. The human within the poem, however, the speaker, doesn't feel connected with spring at all, doesn't feel connected with that idea of youth and hopefulness and newness and freshness. I'm now going to analyse the poem, and I'm going to start off by thinking about the sonnet form, the Shakespearean sonnet form and the Petrarchan sonnet form, and how Smith plays with both of those forms to add to the meaning of her own sonnet. And you can see how Smith is a precursor to the Romantic movement's use of the sonnet form. The sonnet really came into its own in English literature, at least in the Romantic period, and Smith is a really important step in the development to what we consider to be the Romantic sonnet form. So I want to start by looking at the rhyme scheme and the form of the poem. in Smith's poem, we have A, B, A, B, wove, dew, grove, blue. We have C, D, C, D, del, plain, bell again, E, F, E, F, fair, day, care, away, G, G, bring, spring. And that is absolutely, fundamentally a Shakespearean sonnet, also called an English sonnet. An example of this from a sonnet of Shakespeare's is sonnet number 138. It's a great sonnet, I think. It's quite funny. And this is from the 1609 quarto. And you can see exactly the same rhyme scheme. A, B, truth, lies, youth, subtleties, C, D, young, best, tongue, suppressed, E, F, unjust, old, trust, told, G, me, B. The form then echoes the rhyme scheme. You have four, you have four, you have four, and then you have two. So you have 3 quatrains. A quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines, followed by a couplet, which is 2 lines, like a couple, 2. In a Shakespearean sonnet then, the final couplet, the rhyming final couplet, is almost a conclusion in and of itself. It's an aphoristic conclusion. It almost stands alone from the rest of the poem. And indeed it does in terms of rhythm, because it's a couplet and not a quatrain. You can see that particularly here in Shakespeare's sonnet from the 1609 quarto, because the layout highlights the separation of the final couplet through the indentation. It's very clearly laid out here that the 2 final lines are separate from the rest of the poem. Therefore I lie with her and she with me, and in our faults by lies we flattered be. That's almost a standalone statement. Yes, it reflects back on the rest of the poem, but it could almost be read in isolation. And that's made particularly clear here in this sonnet because it literally uses the word therefore. So you've literally got the conclusion. And likewise, Smith, as I've said, uses the same rhyme scheme, the Shakespearean or English sonnet rhyme scheme. So is it as simple as that? Can we say that Smith uses the Shakespearean sonnet form here in this poem? Well, no, not exactly. So the Petrarchan sonnet form is also a poem of 14 lines. That's really fundamental to a sonnet, is that it has to have 14 lines. But the Petrarchan sonnet, instead of having 3 quatrains and a couplet, has an octet and a sestet. Octet, 8 lines, sestet, 6 lines, and then a volta in the middle, or a turn. And the sestet then reflects on what has been stated in the octet. The Petrarchan form is the original Italian form that was then imported into English poetry in the English Renaissance period, so the Elizabethan period, which is why it gets called the Shakespearean sonnet, although there were other poets who used the Shakespearean sonnet form before Shakespeare, such as Thomas Wyatt. And the rhyme scheme again reflects the form. So here, generally speaking, the rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. Sometimes C, D, E, C, D, E. But the point is that you don't have the couplet. You don't have the closing couplet at the end. And the final stanza, so 6 lines, is far more elongated, is far bigger than a couplet. Another example in English is John Keats's first published poem, which was a sonnet called To Solitude, published in the Examiner in May 1816, which I have done a video on elsewhere on my channel, so do have a look at that after this one if you're interested. He also uses this Petrarchan form, and you can see that in Keats's rhyme scheme, and you'll notice that some of the rhymes are actually the same as Smith's, particularly del and bell, and you can see why those two would be appropriate for a poem about sort of spring and about nature, about youthful spring-like nature. And then in the sestet, C, D, D, C, C, D. So it's not a strict Petrarchan sonnet, but the point is that it's very much demarcated. The octet and the sestet are very much demarcated by being dominated by different rhymes. You might also notice that both Charlotte Smith and John Keats mark the turn or the volta in their poems at the beginning of the sestet with R. So we have the first description, the octet is often description, and then comes the volta, the turn, and then comes a reflection back on what was said in the octet. Here, both of them go, ah. So it's a sort of breath again, saying that's the description, that's what I've laid out, ah. And then moves on to reflect back on it. So what other ways can we see Smith's sonnet as Petrarchan then rather than Shakespearean? Why does it matter that she's playing with these two forms and using them together in this one poem? Charlotte Smith's, written at the close of spring, then combines Petrarchan and Shakespearean sonnet forms. Essentially the kind of best of both worlds. The Petrarchan form allows for greater expansion in the concluding section, the reflection, because you have 6 lines rather than 2 lines. So very generally, the octet here describes spring, as we can see in the first line of the octet. The garlands fade that spring so lately wore, and humanity opens up the first line of the sestet, line 9. Ah, poor humanity, so frail, so fair. So the final couplet here, the Shakespearean sonnet form, seems to offer a neat aphorism. So it seems to offer a neat conclusion, a direct contrast between spring and unhappiness, because the speaker can't feel happiness in the way that spring comes again. The speaker cannot feel that happiness will ever come again. But the volta, the R, shows a development from the first 8 lines. The octet describes the flowers of spring, and then the sestet reflects on the human response to nature. And that's a very typical English romantic sonnet form, that you have this description of nature in the octet, and then you have the human engagement with that description of nature in the sestet. Particularly the final 3 words of the octet and the sestet allow for a direct comparison between what is being described in the octet and what's being described in the sestet. So at the end, final 3 words of the octet, her reads again the final lines of the sestet, no second spring. Her reads again, no second spring. So spring has reads again, it comes back, it has flowers again, it renews again, rebirth if you like, but the speaker has no second spring. So there's a direct comparison put forward there at the end of the octet and the end of the sestet. And another sort of beautiful thing that Charlotte Smith does here is end the whole poem on the idea of no second spring. So spring is the final word, and then nothing happens after the word spring. There's nothing after spring. There's just death. There's just nothingness. So I want to consider now how the details show us that the Petrarchan elements in her sonnet work to complicate the apparent simplicity of the closing couplet, so the Shakespearean aspect of the sonnet. So I'm going to look at enjambment, I'm going to look at diction, and then I'm going to look at repetition. Smith plays with the use of enjambment at the opening of the sestet, lines 9 through to line 10. Enjambment is when the meaning of a line goes over the line, as we say. So it's not end stopped. You don't come to the end of the clause at the end of the line. In use of enjambment, going over the line is necessary for the grammar of the sentence. So you have to read over the line in order for it to make grammatical sense. The opening line of the sestet bleeds into the second line of the sestet. You can only understand line 10, the second line of the sestet, if you read it in conjunction with line 9. Are the fond visions of thy early day doesn't make sense unless you read it with what's gone before it. So frail, so fair are the fond visions of thy early day. And this unsettles the rhythm of the poem, which up until this point, you can come to a pause at the end of each line and the next line will still make sense. So, the garlands fade that spring so early wove, pause. Each simple flower that she had nursed in dew, pause. Anemones that spangled every grove, pause. The primrose wan and harebell mildly blue, pause. No more shall violets linger in the dell, pause. Or purple orchis variegate the plain, pause. Till spring again shall call forth every bell, pause. And dress with humid hands her wreaths again, pause. But you cannot do that then when you get to this line. Ah, poor humanity, so frail, so fair, pause, are the fond visions of thy early day. It doesn't make sense. You have to read it grammatically with the previous line. So frail, so fair are the fond visions of thy early day. The rhythm encourages you to pause at the end of line 9, but by pausing at the end of line 9, you disrupt the meaning of the poem because there shouldn't be a pause there. And what this does is it sets humanity in contrast with the natural rhythms of the seasons, which are cyclical and complete. So we have a sense of fullness and completeness from the octet, the opening 8 lines, because each line is full and you can pause at the end of it and there's a sense of wholeness and completeness and satisfaction because you can read it in a measured way like that, as I just did, pausing at the end of each line. The form of the octet then mirrors the image of spring, image of the seasons, which is that they are cyclical, which is that they come again, which is that they have their time and their place, and you get to the end, you get to the full point, and then it dies, that line dies, but another line comes again and it starts again, and there's a sense of natural process and natural equal rhythm to it. And then you get to this bit where humanity is brought in and the rhythm is disrupted. It unsettles the smoothness that had been established. I'm now going to think about how Smith explicitly uses diction to encourage readers to compare nature and humanity. Within the poem, we learn from line 2, nature nurses. She had nursed. Sense of caregiving, of looking after. Whereas humanity offers corrosive care, the complete opposite of nursing. And tyrant passion. Again, tyranny, tyrant passion, the opposite of a harmonious Mother Nature image. Humanity has been corrupted, in fact has almost been made unnatural. So nature is aligned with nursing, with tender care. Humanity doesn't nurse as nature does. Also, the word fairy colours of nature I think is interesting. The flowers in the octet fade away. So nature is aligned with the idea of fairy, with the ethereal, with the magical, with the unreal. And the paradox or the contradiction here is that we might more often think of nature as being the most real, and yet here it's aligned with the magical, fairy. But it's almost as if within this poem, humanity is sort of unnatural and unreal because it doesn't have this beautiful fairy quality. So in the octet, when we are told the garlands fade, and she's using that word fade there, there's a sense, and moving on to ideas of repetition, when she uses the word fade in the first octet, the beginning of the stanza, nature is described, spring is described as fading away, the flowers of spring are fading away. But that's just part of the natural process, and next year they will come again. In the sestet, however, when that is associated with humanity, they're not flowers, they're fairy colours, they're kind of impish and ethereal, and it's the suggestion that what's obtainable for spring and for nature is kind of ungraspable, unreal, isn't possible for humanity. They're only fairy colours, they're not real colours. I'm now going to think about the way that Smith repeats the word again. This is a poem all about something coming again, spring coming again, happiness coming again. So it's worth thinking about when she does use the word again and when she doesn't use the word again, and what that repetition or non-repetition does to our understanding of the poem. So we've got spring again, wreaths again, and then in the final line of the poem we've got no. So It's again, again, no. So again and again in the octet when it refers to spring, and no, spring, when it refers to humanity. So spring will come again and again, but the speaker's happiness won't come again, 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 no. I think we should also pay attention to the dual meaning of the word wreaths. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it's an arrangement of flowers, a decoration, but it's also associated with death, and it's what one lays on a grave. So there's a real mournful implication, actually, from the speaker. Spring lives again and then dies again. Spring again, wreaths again. Spring again, wreaths again. Birth again, death again. Birth again, death again. The speaker sees the wreaths in the spring's flowers. For the speaker, then, the inevitable death of spring is already present in thinking of its flowers. Spring again, wreaths again. Spring again, wreaths again. The speaker can only see spring in terms of the inevitable death that is coming, because spring will end. I want to close now by thinking about a further piece of brilliance that Charlotte Smith does in terms of the construction of the overall poem. So the octet, as I've already said, is about spring, and the sestet is about humanity, having no second spring. The sonnet opens and closes with reference to spring. One might think that we can read the whole poem as echoing the cyclical nature of the seasons. The start of spring, the death of spring, the start of spring, the death of spring. Like a cyclical new year. But the difference here is that actually when you look at it again, the poem doesn't start with spring. It doesn't begin in spring. It begins when spring has already died. It starts at the death of spring. The very opening is not actually spring, it's the garlands fade. The fading that opens the poem. The death opens the poem. So spring has already passed, it's already gone. The speaker doesn't begin in the midst of the hopefulness of spring, because hope has already died for the speaker. We don't see spring in the present, in its hopeful state. We only see spring as something already dead through the speaker. Spring has already gone at the beginning of the octet. There is no second spring within the poem. It doesn't come again. There's only the recollection of spring. It is not possible to be in the midst of another spring, which the poem's form exemplifies. Once hope is gone, it's gone. So what then is the significance of Charlotte Smith's mixture of the Shakespearean sonnet form and the Petrarchan sonnet form? Why has happiness no second spring is the final question. It's the question within the Shakespearean couplet. And it's a question, obviously. It's not actually a conclusion. The Shakespearean sonnet that we were looking at earlier, 138, concludes with a definite conclusion, therefore. This concludes with a question. You'll also note that happiness is not mentioned anywhere else in the poem, so it's introduced in the final couplet. It's not drawing a conclusion about what's already being said, it's adding a different dimension, it's bringing in happiness and it's asking a question. But that question is answered through considering the poem's Petrarchan form. Human happiness has no second spring because humanity unnaturally treats others with tyranny and corrosiveness, as we see from the sestet, and that happiness and that inability to get happiness that's in the final question is linked to humanity through the Petrarchan form because it is within the sestet. That's divided from spring, natural spring, which nurses others. And because spring nurses others, the flowers, it can achieve happiness, whereas humanity, with its tyrant passion and corrosive care, cannot achieve that natural happiness. And those are shown to be distinct from each other, nature and humanity, because they are divided by the volta. To conclude then, the poem forms part of Charlotte Smith's Elegiac sonnets. An elegy is a lament for the dead. So what is being lamented as being dead in this poem? In this sonnet written at the close of spring, what's dead and what the speaker is lamenting is the promise of the hope of spring. Spring, as a metaphor for hope for the speaker, has died. And spring is no longer a metaphor for hope, it is a metaphor for hope lost permanently. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed exploring Charlotte Smith's beautiful sonnet written at the close of spring. Remember, if you like this video, do please give it a thumbs up and do leave any comments that you have below. I really do love hearing from you.